Now, MRO data, or maintenance, repair, and operating, that is spare parts and materials that are used for maintenance, also need to have taxonomies and standardized classifications. And you can have a taxonomy established for, each class and subclass of spare part or material item that you keep in your storeroom or order when needed in either case. So descriptions have to be consistent, as we all know. When you look at a list of catalog descriptions, you're going to find bearing spelled 100 different ways, and of course that causes all kinds of problems when we're searching for bearings. If we type it a certain way, we're only going to get a subset of the data in the system and then draw some wrong conclusions and make bad decisions, or take more time to reach a good decision than is necessary. So here's an example of a taxonomy for an item. This is a pillow block bearing, and you can see some thought has gone into ahead of time before you start creating equipment records. What kind of information do we want to keep track of for pillow block bearings? And I'll propose to you that a full set of taxonomies for assets and spare parts at a typical industrial plant would probably have anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 different combinations of class and subclass for all of the assets and all of the spare parts that you're going to want to keep in your master equipment list and in your materials catalog. And it's wise to get these taxonomies set up ahead of time and then apply them consistently across all of the assets and all of the items in the database. There are companies out there that have these taxonomy systems already created for both assets and material items, and most companies today don't reinvent the wheel. They basically buy them and save themselves lots of time and energy. Here's an example in eMaint of a attribute tab for a spare part, for an item record, if you will. And you can see, I think I zoom in on this. No, I don't. So you can see, the different attributes that we are keeping for. This happens to be an AC motor that we might have in stock. So here down on the left-hand lower third of the screen, you'll see the various attributes that we want to keep track of for an AC motor. All AC motors would have these same attributes. Now let's talk briefly about descriptions. Descriptions for equipment items are often very mixed up. Not only are they inconsistent in terms of spelling and format, but also in many systems, most top-tier systems today, including eMaint, have separate facility for equipment records or asset records separate from functional location records. And I think a lot of the poor data or misuse of the description field in the equipment record is a remnant of habits that grew up 15, 20 years ago when most of the CMMS systems didn't have separate tables for assets versus locations. In essence, what I'm referring to here is that many people mistakenly describe assets in terms of how they're used or what they do, and that's wrong. Good best practices of master data suggest that the equipment record should be described in terms of its physical characteristics and not in terms of its role or how it's used or what it's doing. That latter descriptive information should be reserved for the functional location records. That way, when, let's say, a pump or a motor is moved off of a foundation and gone into a rebuild process and maybe brought back into the storeroom for use later someplace else, data maintenance for that equipment record is minimal. Likewise, the functional location that represents that foundation, so to speak, let's say a pumping location, has the information in its description that describes what function is performed at that location. You can see a couple of examples of good examples and bad examples here for asset descriptions. So good examples, you see only information in there that describes the physical asset itself, nothing in there that says what the asset is doing in the system. Bad examples, you can see information here that talks about what the asset is doing. And again, I contend that best practices suggest we should not be doing that. There's another kind of big question a lot of people have, and that is how granular does our equipment database need to be? What is an asset? You know, do we set up an asset record for every nut and bolt in the plant? And of course, that answer is obviously no. But at what level of granularity do we stop in terms of considering something an asset, and below that point consider it a spare part or a material item? And there are some good guidelines out there. Here's one example of 5 questions that you would ask yourself about the asset in question. And if the answer is yes to any of these questions, then it's a likely candidate to be set up as an equipment record in the CMMS system representing this particular item. You know, one example is, you know, if you have regulatory requirements for an item that may not seem large, expensive, or critical, but let's say a relief valve, which has all kinds of regulatory requirements on it, certainly that's something that may not be critical. Well, of course, that's a bad example. It would be critical. But it may not be an expensive item to maintain. It may not be a maintenance recurring problem or an expected maintenance problem, but it certainly has regulatory requirements that would require it to be set up as its own asset, and so on. So the whole question of granularity in the asset database is one that there is very good guidance out there in the asset master data management field that can give you the criteria you need to make the correct decision as to where you break from assets, in essence reaching the bottom of the asset hierarchy and then moving below that into the realm of spare parts. Now I want to talk a little bit about functional locations versus assets. I implied before that functional locations should be set up in eMaint or any other system representing the various, just as the name implies, functional location, and then equipment that is used to provide that function that may be residing in that location is set up as equipment or asset records. And the functional location, once again, describes what's going on at that location, what function is being performed. This example I'm showing here happens to be an in-feed conveyor on palletizing line number 1. That's the description of the functional location. And then you would, below that, have children that would be asset records for the, in this case, the conveyor belt itself, the gearbox, and the motor. Those would be 3 separate equipment records that would parent up to the functional location of the in-feed conveyor. This is not an eMaint screenshot. This is a screenshot from a different system, but similar functionality. You can see we have functional location records, and then we eventually go down to equipment records. In this example, we're making a little bit of a distinction between functional locations and what we are calling reference locations. They're still location records in the CMMS system, but you can see the top level is a plant in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and then there are 3 different main parts of that plant. You can see at the top, those are basically big systems, if you will. The crush part of the plant, the refinery part of the plant, and then the utilities. And then if you take utilities, that breaks down into a handful of utilities that further break down, in our example here, to the boiler. The boiler then breaks down into ash handling, chemical treatment, and so on. And when we look at the pumping system for the boiler, we have 3 functional locations below it, which you can see here as 2 pumps and a boiler feed pump. And that boiler feed pump example is the bottom of the functional location hierarchy. Then we move to assets or equipment records. And you can see here, excuse me, that the descriptions for the functional locations are describing the function and the use and what's happening there. while the equipment records are being described strictly in terms of physical characteristics of the equipment. The fact that this equipment is plugged into this location is enough to give the understanding of what this pump centrifugal might be doing. We know today it happens to be plugged into the boiler feed pump number 1 slot in the boiler feed water system in the utilities plant of this particular Council Bluffs plant. Okay? There's also a motor down there. The motor is set up separately at the same level as the pump. Some people elect, depending on the functionality of the CMMS, to parent the motor to the driven piece of equipment, and you can do that. So you can actually have some hierarchy even within the equipment file itself, meaning that you would see the motor indented, meaning that it's parented up to the pump, and that's possible as well in some systems.